Guillermo del Toro has had a lot of success creating vampire-centric media right from his debut horror film, Cronos. Recently, he joined hands with Chuck Hogan to co-author the Strain trilogy and explore these fascinating supernatural creatures, and the book series was soon developed into a television horror show. The Strain first debuted in 2014, and it introduced us to a whole new world of vampires, or Strigoi as they call them on the show. Created by an ancient being known as the Master, the Strigoi had quite a unique appearance and life cycle, and today we shall explore their anatomy in detail and tell you all about them. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you, and let's begin. What are the different types of vampires shown in the series? To begin with, the Ancients were the oldest and most powerful vampires in the series, originating from the fallen angel Azrael. There were 7 Ancients, and 3 of these vampires came from the New World, while 4 of them originated in the Old World. 6 of these Ancients considered immortality sacred and would kill their victims after feeding on them to ensure that they did not catch the virus and turn into vampires. However, the 7th Ancient, also known as the Master, went on a rampage to create numerous Strigoi vampires that were under his control with the help of a telepathic link. Ancients were considered sentient beings, and they originated at specific sites in the world. For instance, the Master originated in the Americas, also known as the New World, and he traveled to the Old World to stay with the other Ancients. However, these Ancients decided to head to the New World during colonization, while the Master chose to stay back and bide his time until the Vampire War. While the Master had infected several humans and turned them into the Strigoi, there were some unique instances where a human-Strigoi hybrid was created. These hybrids were a part of a group known as the Born, who earned the same name because they were birthed into this life instead of being turned like other vampires. This typically happened when a vampire fed on a pregnant woman, and the Born had special characteristics such as the ability to handle sun exposure, exist without any worms in their bodies, and so on. Quinlan was a famous hybrid that belonged to this group, and he came into existence when the Master accidentally fed on a pregnant woman in 40 AD.
Hold on.
How does one turn into the Strigoi vampire? The Strigoi were created with the help of a tiny needle, thin capillary worm, also known as the strain worm. When one of these worms were released into a human host's bloodstream, it would trigger the spread of an incurable and fast-moving virus that caused radical changes in the human body. This virus was capable of manipulating the host's genes and soon transformed their human body into that of a mature, fully grown Strigoi vampire. There are several ways in which these strain worms could be released into the bloodstream, but they mainly spread when a vampire feeds on a human host. In other cases, these worms could slither their way into a human body through an open wound or injury that gave them access to the host's bloodstream. These injuries did not have to be serious, and even a tiny scratch on one's skin was enough for a worm to slither its way into the human body. From this point on, this worm would reproduce at a speedy pace to multiply and spread the infection throughout the body.
Once the strain worms enter a host, their transformation is almost inevitable.
Exploring the Strigoi physiology and physical appearance. The Strigoi underwent gradual changes as it transformed into a vampire from a human body after the initial worm infection. This infection was followed by a painful process wherein a newly turned human stayed in a state of suspended animation for a day before rising as a vampire. These vampires initially felt quite confused, and their disoriented state of mind was reflected in their clumsy, awkward actions. However, they soon gained control over their body and reached complete mental and physical maturity within a month. While the Strigoi has several unique features, the retractable proboscis that typically hides beneath this creature's tongue is its most discernible characteristic, and it was the first thing that developed post-transformation. This long proboscis can be described as a stinger that extended for as much as 6 feet away from its mouth and helped the Strigoi feed on other beings. The stinger could latch onto a human prey's limbs or throat and suck the blood out of their body while simultaneously infecting them with strain worms that would turn these humans into vampires. Since the stinger took up some space, the Strigoi's jaw was set at a lower hinge as compared to a human, while its mouth was a gaping hole from where the stinger was deployed. The stinger was essentially a modified tissue structure created from the host's throat and lungs, and it took away their ability to speak. The Strigoi were typically seen grunting or communicating with monosyllables such as mom, dad, love, or help whenever they needed to speak. While they were physically incapable of speech, they could perform telepathy and communicate with others without having to use actual words. The Strigoi evolved from a pre-existing human body that shed its human traits over a period of 1 week after exposure to the strain worms. Initially, these humans lost their hair and fingernails, and their external noses and ears atrophied in order to leave a smooth and featureless body. A fully developed vampire's body could be compared to a smooth marble surface, with a pale complexion, often accompanied by a red flush after a meal. The Strigoi's eyes had black pupils with red sclera around them, and a white membrane shielded their eyes and protected them. While the Strigoi vampires lost all useless physical features such as hair or fingernails, it must be noted that they grew sharp fangs that replaced their human teeth, even though these fangs would be useless in the presence of a stinger. During the transformation, the human's middle finger would grow longer, and the lost fingernail would be replaced with a sharp talon. With respect to the internal organs, the digestive and circulatory systems underwent a lot of changes and turned into one single interconnected network. The Strigoi's internal organs were in the form of connected sacs, and the nutrition from the blood they consumed would travel through these sacs through a thick white fluid that was similar to blood. The strain worms that turn humans into vampires traveled through this fluid, and one could even spot them moving around beneath the vampire's pale, thin skin. The master had the ability to regurgitate these worms to possess another host body, but almost all other vampires did not have this ability. Their digestive systems were suction-based, and all the bodily waste was excreted in the form of an ammonia-based spray. These vampires typically excreted while feeding on a human, purging their old food while consuming fresh blood. Sometimes the Strigoi felt fatigue from excessive blood digestion, and they would shut down briefly. These creatures lacked the ability to fall asleep, but they did shut down and go underground during the day in order to avoid the sun. Generally, the Strigoi had high body temperatures around 48.9 degrees Celsius, and other beings could feel their body heat radiating from a distance. While the Strigoi might appear weak or sick, they were agile creatures with unimaginable strength. They could lift an entire human off their feet or crush their skulls with just one hand. Their bodies were quite durable, and they could endure most attacks without feeling any pain. In case they suffered from any injuries, their bodies healed at a faster pace than humans, but it must be noted that they could not regenerate body parts like most supernatural beings. Among other things, the Strigoi were known for their speed, and their movements appeared as a blur when they ran after prey. Lastly, and most importantly, the Strigoi were blessed with immortality and had an endless lifespan as long as they avoided sun exposure. Their parasitic bodies did not weaken with time like humans, and in some cases, powerful vampires could even transfer their consciousness to a new host body with the help of a torrential capillary worm transfer. How did their senses work? Like most nocturnal beings, these vampires had heightened senses that helped them adapt to their lifestyle. After being infected, these vampires underwent a biological metamorphosis that lasted a week and lost their color vision. Instead, they gained a kind of vision similar to thermal imaging and could discern heat signatures as monochromatic halos. Besides vision, they gained enhanced hearing, even though the transformation process resulted in them losing their ears. Their sense of hearing was sharp enough to enable them to hear the blood pumping through the veins of their prey. Moreover, a fully grown vampire had a sharp sense of smell that enabled it to smell the carbon dioxide exhaled by a human while breathing, which made it relatively easy for them to detect prey. While their enhanced senses aided them in their hunt, these vampires' greatest strength lay in the hive mind they shared with the ancient that had propagated them. While most Strigoi were created by the seventh ancient, the Master, all seven ancients could create vampires and establish a telepathic link with them. Through this link, the ancients could share sensory information with the vampires and send instructions to a particular vampire individually, no matter how far away they were. Over the series, we learn that lead has the necessary properties to block their mental link and disrupt a vampire's connection to its ancient progenitor. This had quite a detrimental effect on a vampire's functioning, as these creatures could not speak and only relied on telepathy to communicate with others. They were biologically incapable of speaking and were seen using telepathy even if they wanted to speak through humans. In a typical scenario, they transmitted their thoughts to a human's internal monologue, and sometimes, when they disguised themselves as humans, they pretended to speak by moving their lips, but still relied on telepathy to share their thoughts. The ancients used a technique called the murmur to send a mental shockwave that could overwhelm the surrounding humans and render them unconscious. Sometimes vampires experience an uncontrollable urge to infect their loved ones. This typically happens when they care too much about a human being. They had the ability to spot these loved ones from far away, much like a pigeon's homing instinct that drives it to navigate its home from great distances. Can the strain vampire reproduce? The strain vampires can most certainly reproduce, but their means of reproduction greatly differ from that of humans. If a vampire ended up feeding on a pregnant woman, the fetus would be directly impacted and turn into a creature akin to a vampire. However, this child would mostly inherit its mother's traits, which was also the case with the born vampires, who were quite intelligent. The born species were technically vampires, but they were similar to their mothers in terms of characteristics, and they also did not have any strain worms in their bloodstream. They needed to feed on human blood and preferred B-positive blood, just like most Strigoi vampires. In general, vampire reproduction is mainly carried out through the means of a viral infection and not by any sexual acts. During their transformation process from a human to a Strigoi, any and all useless organs would atrophy, and it is presumed that their genitalia also atrophy as the human turns into a mature vampire. What are some of the major weaknesses of the strain vampire? These vampires shared several traditional weaknesses from common folklore, such as their inability to step out in sunlight. Primarily, ultraviolet light in the UVC range had germicidal properties that could disintegrate a vampire's virus-laden body. While exposure to sunlight could potentially result in the complete desiccation of a vampire's body, local UVC light sources, like fluorescent lights, could be useful in keeping a vampire away. Besides sunlight, using silver in a metallic or chemical mist form could severely injure or even kill a vampire. Silver can disinfect a vampire's viral biology and cause them immense pain and suffering to the extent that vampires fear silver. In some scenarios, vampires could be killed due to severe brain trauma by shooting them in the head or smashing their brains one way or the other. Besides the brain, even severing the spinal column could cause a vampire's organ structure to crumble, leaving them vulnerable. Pharmaceuticals such as warfarin had the ability to thin blood and decrease blood clotting, which could be toxic to vampires. When Ichorus fed on cetricane, the warfarin and cetricane's bloodstream poisoned Ichorus, and he soon fell immobile. When it comes to the Strigoi, we must note that these creatures severely lack true sentience unless their master bestows them with it. They were typically quite feral, uncoordinated, and inadequate at strategizing, and could easily be tricked into falling into a trap. A few experimental tricks could also be used to defeat vampires, and one such trick involved genetic engineering. By mating microorganisms that could be fatal to the Strigoi but transmissible to the rest of the population, one could create a bioweapon that would only target the Strigoi. This bioweapon would target the cerebrospinal fluid of these creatures and prevent the Strigoi's bodily cells from communicating with one another or even with their master. Traditional methods to ward off vampires with garlic show little promise and could not be considered a weakness, at least with respect to the Strigoi. Marvelous verdict. To sum it up, the Strigoi vampires were most certainly quite an interesting breed of vampires, and Guillermo del Toro has once again done an excellent job at captivating the audience's interest with his imagination. From their grotesque yet fascinating physical features to sharp senses, the Strigoi are impressive creatures to say the least, and we hope you enjoyed this deep dive into their physiology. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.